Welcome to AI Paper Slop. Today we are looking directly at a really fascinating paper from July 2026 called Concurrent Image Understanding and Generation.
Right, and the subtitle there is Self-Correcting Coupled Markov Jump Processes, and it's by Min-Kwan Lei and a whole team from Google DeepMind, and Stony Brook University.
Exactly. And let's just get straight to the core insights for everyone listening so you know exactly what we're dealing with today. So, current multimodal masked diffusion models, or MDMs, they can actually generate text and images in parallel, right?
Yeah, they can, but the existing samplers treat these modalities completely independently within each denoising step.
Which causes what the authors call modality drift. Basically, the text and the image end up completely contradicting each other.
And standard MDMs, well, they can't remask. So once a mistake is made, it's just permanent. You can't take back a token once it's generated.
Right. But this paper introduces a new training-free sampler called CO2 Jump, which completely fixes this.
Yeah, it uses entropy-based gating and cross-modal attention, so one modality can actually check the other's confidence, and it does all this within a single forward pass.
Which is huge. Plus, it introduces a way to undo those cross-modal contradictions.
Exactly. It gets state-of-the-art performance on concurrent visual reasoning tasks. But most importantly, it's the only sampler that scales monotonically with increased compute.
Which we will definitely unpack. It's going to fundamentally change how you view inference if you're building multimodal pipelines. So to start, why are masked diffusion models theoretically the holy grail for this kind of parallel generation in the first place?
Well, to understand that, you really have to look at the architecture. MDMs operate on a unified vocabulary.
Unlike traditional autoregressive models, right? Where you have to do things sequentially.
Exactly. Autoregressive models force a one-way flow. You have to decode a whole string of text first, and only then can you generate an image based on that completed text. But MDMs treat text tokens and image patches as part of the exact same continuous time formulation.
And they use those Markov jump processes for that.
Right. So instead of predicting the next token in a sequence, you start with a sequence entirely composed of an absorbing mask state. They usually denoted as an M.
Got it. So it's all just blank masks at the start.
Yeah. And over time, tokens jump from this masked state into concrete predicted tokens. So theoretically, you can update the text and the image simultaneously.
That sounds great on paper, but looking at the baselines you brought in from the sources, like UDVLA or Emeta Parallel, it seems that theoretical promise kind of falls apart in practice.
It really does. I mean, these samplers claim to do concurrent generation, but when you look under the hood, they factorize each denoising step.
And that structural separation is the real issue here.
It's the root of the whole problem. When they factorize the step, the text updates and the image updates are only looking at the joint state from the previous step.
So there's no real-time communication?
None. There's absolutely no instantaneous cross-modal feedback happening inside the current step you're computing. They are nominally parallel in time, but mathematically completely isolated from each other.
Which leads right to an analogy I was thinking of. It's like you hire a writer and an illustrator to create a comic book, you lock them in a room and force them to work simultaneously.
That's a perfect way to picture it.
But the catch is they can only see each other's work at the end of every hour. And worse, they have to draw everything in permanent marker. That isolation causes the modality drift.
Yeah, because if the writer commits to a highly specific description at, say, minute 15, and the illustrator draws something completely contradictory based on an earlier assumption.
They don't even realize it until they sync up later.
And by the time they sync up, the damage is already done. What makes this structural flaw so fatal for complex tasks is that standard masked diffusion models, like we said, lack an undo button.
The permanent marker.
Exactly. Once a token jumps from that masked M state to a concrete token, it is locked in. The sampler cannot remask it. So if the image branch commits to a visual path that the text branch later contradicts, that error just persists and corrupts the rest of the sampling process.
So the core question is, how does this new CO2 jump sampler propose fixing this permanent marker problem without just, giving up and going back to slow, sequential, autoregressive decoding?
Well, the solution lies in a new framework they call self-correcting coupled Markov jump processes, or SC-CMJP for short.
Okay, that's a mouthful. How does it actually work?
Instead of assuming the unmasking rates for each position are conditionally independent, CO2 Jump actively crossweighs the commitments of the text and image branches within every single denoising step.
Oh, wow. So it forces one modality's unmasking schedule to dynamically adapt to the confidence of the other modality?
Exactly. It connects them.
But hold on. If we want the image branch to adapt to the freshly sampled text update within the exact same step, wouldn't that require a second forward pass?
You'd think so, right?
Yeah, because a naive joint reverse posterior would mean running the whole model twice. Once to get the text, and then again to condition the image on that new text. That would totally tank the efficiency.
It would. It would be computationally prohibitive. But the authors found a brilliant workaround using chain rule factorization.
Okay, how did they avoid the second pass?
They split the joint probability into two terms. The first term handles the text update, conditioning only on the current joint state. And to avoid that second forward pass for the image term, CO2 Jump uses an asymmetric scoring rule.
An asymmetric scoring rule.
Right. For the text branch, it simply relies on its own self-confidence, generated by standard Gumbel-Max sampling over the logits.
Let me just stop you there to make sure we're translating this for everyone following along. When you mention Gumbel-Max sampling over the logits, are you basically saying the text branch is just looking at the raw probability scores of its own vocabulary to decide how sure it is about a specific word?
That is a highly accurate way to frame it, yeah. The text token basically says, based on my own internal distribution, I am 90% sure this word should be apple.
Okay, makes sense.
But the magic really happens on the image side. The image update doesn't just look at its own internal distribution. It actually uses the text branch's self-confidence as a low-cost surrogate for the text's future state.
Wait, but how does that text confidence actually cross over to the image side without running the model again? Like, physically, how does the signal get there?
It hijacks the latent cross-modal attention weights.
Oh, because those are already being calculated.
Exactly. During that single forward pass, the frozen MDM backbone is naturally computing attention matrices. It's already calculating how much each image patch needs to care about each text token just to maintain general cohesion.
So CO2 Jump just extracts those pre-computed attention weights and uses them as a bridge.
Yeah, it uses them to shuttle the text confidence scores across the modality gap. The network already did the heavy lifting. The sampler just reuses the signal.
That's incredibly elegant. Okay, so if you are the image branch, you now have two competing signals in your ear. You have your own self-belief about what the image should be, and you have this cross-modal signal beamed over from the text branch telling you how confident the text is.
Right, you've got these two voices.
So how does the model mathematically decide which voice to listen to?
To manage those competing signals, the model computes a single scalar gate, which they call lambda. This creates what the paper terms coupled confidence.
And what dictates the value of this lambda gate?
It's dictated by the mean token-level Shannon entropy across all positions in a given modality.
Okay, you mentioned Shannon entropy, which can get pretty dense. For those of us who haven't cracked open an information theory textbook recently, how does that translate to the image branch actually knowing when to ask for help?
Think of Shannon entropy as a mathematical measure of confusion or chaos.
Okay, chaos.
Right. If the image branch is trying to generate a local region and the probability distribution is completely flat, meaning the model thinks 20 different colors are all equally likely, that region has high Shannon entropy.
It has no idea what to do.
Exactly. And when that happens, the lambda gate shifts towards one. This forces the image branch to suppress its own noisy guesses and defer to the text branch for evidentiary support.
That brings us right back to the comic book analogy. It's like a dynamic trust slider.
Yes, exactly like a trust slider.
If the illustrator has no idea what a specific visual concept is supposed to look like, meaning they have high image entropy, the slider shifts and they heavily rely on the writer's notes.
Right.
But if the writer is struggling for words and has high text entropy, the slider shifts the other way and the illustrators paint it from memory based on their own confidence.
The data supports that dynamic perfectly. However, the researchers actually ran into a massive scaling problem when they tried to combine these signals practically.
Because of the vocabularies.
Yeah. The text and image vocabularies operate on entirely different orders of magnitude. A standard text tokenizer might have, say, 30,000 tokens, but the continuous image space is quantized into hundreds of thousands or even millions of states.
Right.
So you absolutely cannot directly compare absolute scalar confidence scores across these modalities. The math simply breaks down.
I can see why. It's like trying to compare the wealth of someone who earns in dollars to someone who earns in yen. The raw numbers don't make any sense when you put them next to each other.
That's a great way to put it.
So how did the researchers solve this currency exchange problem?
To stick with your financial analogy, instead of looking at the raw currency, you look at their economic bracket. They project the scalar scores into an empirical percentile rank within their own modality.
That's clever.
Right. So the text token doesn't say, my raw confidence score is 0.8. It says, I am in the 99th percentile of confidence compared to all other text tokens.
And the image token does the exact same thing for its modality.
Exactly. By sharing this percentile rank space, the mixture becomes well-conditioned and perfectly comparable, regardless of how massive the vocabulary disparity is.
That is a really elegant fix. So they know who to trust using the lambda gate, and they can combine the scores using percentile ranks to generate this coupled confidence. But we still have the permanent marker problem.
Right, the undo button.
Yeah, knowing you made a mistake is only half the battle. How do they actually give the model an eraser?
This introduces the self-correction aspect of the framework, which leverages birth-death dynamics.
Birth-death dynamics, okay.
As we discussed earlier, standard masked diffusion only has births, the unmasking of tokens. CO2 Jump introduces deaths, which is the formalized remasking of tokens.
Now, I know prior work like RAMDM did attempt a remasking schedule.
It did, but it was modality agnostic. It scored remasks entirely from intramodal likelihoods, which basically meant it was completely blind to cross-modal contradictions.
So the older models might remask a token just because the image branch itself was slightly unsure, but it wouldn't remask a token if the image branch was highly confident but completely contradicted the text.
Yes, exactly. And that is where CO2 Jump fundamentally changes the game.
Yeah.
It remasks the lowest confidence committed tokens based entirely on the new coupled confidence score.
So it's looking at both.
Right. If an unmasked token drops below a dynamic confidence threshold, it dies. It reverts back to the absorbing mask state, which frees it up to be correctly generated in a later step.
Your sources included this really compelling graph called the coupling quadrant that plots every single image side remasking event. When you look at those data points, how does this birth-death dynamic actually play out in practice?
The quadrant maps self-confidence on the x-axis against the cross signal from the text on the axis. The vast majority of the remasking events cluster in the bottom left.
Which is what you'd expect, right?
Yeah, that's the expected behavior. Both the image's self-confidence and the text's cross-signal are low. The token is objectively bad in both modalities, so it dies. But the critical insight is the dense hotspot in the bottom right quadrant.
Okay, so the bottom right would mean the image token had very high self-confidence, but the text branch was sending a very low cross-signal.
Exactly. The image branch essentially thought it was doing a great job, but the text branch completely disagreed.
And under older samplers, that token would survive and ruin the output.
It would. But because of coupled confidence, the text branch's disagreement drags the overall score down, and CO2 Jump brutally kills the image token.
It erases the permanent marker.
Right. It forces the image to realign with the text's structural plan. The ablation studies in the paper demonstrate just how critical this specific mechanism is.
How big of a difference does it make?
If you strip away this cross-modal self-correction, the model's overall understanding plummets by 3.2 on the mean average precision metric.
Wow, 3.2 is massive.
It is. Without the ability to kill confident but contradictory tokens, late-stage errors just accumulate into complete failure.
To really stress test this, the researchers didn't just use standard benchmarks, did they?
No, they actually curated 3 entirely new datasets for this. There's JEDIT1M for image editing, and 2 visual reasoning datasets called JMaze 200K and JNono 200K, which are mazes and nonograms.
Why did they lean so heavily into visual reasoning to prove this sampler works?
Because visual reasoning is the ultimate proving ground for concurrent generation. The text and the image are logically interlocked. In a maze task, the text branch is generating the global coordinates of the solution path, while the image branch is actively drawing that path.
I noticed they made a very deliberate choice to train the model using global coordinates like specific row and column numbers, instead of relative directions like up or left. Why does that distinction matter for parallel decoding?
Because relative directions inherently force an autoregressive dependency. A left command carries 0 meaning unless you know with absolute certainty where you were in the previous step.
Ah, I see.
But global coordinates maintain their semantic meaning, regardless of which other tokens have been unmasked or remasked around them. This aligns the training data perfectly with the non-sequential parallel denoising that the sampler is trying to execute.
And the qualitative results in your sources show just how effective this is. You can see the baselines like MDM literally wandering into wrong corridors or drawing paths straight through solid walls.
Yeah, it's pretty glaring.
Yeah.
By step 160, the MDM baseline actually has the correct text answer generated, but the image is drifted onto a completely wrong path.
But CO2 Jump perfectly satisfies the clues.
It does. And to build on how they evaluated these results, we should look at their approach to the mGedit bench. Generative editing is notoriously difficult to benchmark.
Because there's no single right answer, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
If you prompt a model to change the car to red, there are 1 million pixel variations that satisfy that prompt. You can't just overlay the output on a static ground truth image and check for pixel-perfect accuracy.
So how did they test it?
To get around this, they use Gemini 3 Flash as a pseudo-scene graph evaluator.
Meaning they use a separate large language model to look at the generated images and verify if the semantic edits actually took place in the scene.
Yes. They initialized CO2 Jump on the Lumina DMO backbone and evaluated it against Qwen3VL8B, which is a massive sequential model.
And how did it do?
Remarkably, CO2 Jump beat the sequential grounder. Even though Qwen3 was evaluating the very images CO2 Jump generated, CO2 Jump's concurrent understanding was so sharp that it exceeded the sequential model on target MAP. It scored 0.346 to Qwen's 0.330.
Which proves that better underlying comprehension directly translates to higher fidelity generation.
Exactly.
Now, if you are an ML engineer tuning inference parameters and listening to this, there is one specific finding in this paper that is going to completely change your workflow, and that's monotonic scaling. The relationship between compute and accuracy here breaks all the established rules of diffusion samplers.
It is a massive paradigm shift. In standard diffusion inference, your main lever is the NFE, or number of function evaluations. It dictates how many denoising steps the model takes.
Right.
For baselines like MDM and M-parallel, if you push them past 64 NFEs, their performance actually degrades.
Wait, if you give the baseline models more time to think, they get worse. Why does taking more steps cause them to fail?
It comes back to that structural isolation we discussed earlier. Because the uncoupled schedules are mathematically isolated within each step, taking more steps just creates more opportunities for the modalities to diverge.
Oh, so every step is a risk.
Yeah, every single step is a micro-commitment. If you take 128 steps without the text and image branches talking to each other, they make 128 tiny, uncoordinated deviations.
And those deviations compound.
Exactly. They compound, and the modalities drift into completely separate logical trajectories. They just end up overcorrecting blindly.
But CO2 Jump doesn't suffer from that divergence. The paper shows CO2 Jump is the only sampler tested whose performance scales monotonically up to 512 NFEs.
The data is undeniable. Because CO2 Jump actively crossweighs confidence within every single step, it uses those extra NFEs productively.
Instead of compounding errors.
Right. Every extra step becomes an opportunity for microcorrection. The text and image branches use the extra compute to negotiate, check each other's work, and tighten their joint alignment.
So for the people deploying these models, this means you can treat inference time as a literal dial for accuracy.
Yes, exactly.
You have a highly complex visual reasoning task. You don't need to retrain a larger model. You can just throw more compute at CO2 Jump during inference, and it will continuously self-correct and get smarter.
The benefits of cross-modal coupling don't saturate early. They really do compound across the trajectory. At 8 NFEs, all the samplers perform roughly the same because there hasn't been enough time for drift to occur. But at 512 NFEs, CO2 Jump is light years ahead of the baselines. It is true, instantaneous self-correction at scale.
This raises an incredible forward-looking implication that I want to leave everyone with today. The researchers explicitly note in their conclusion that the SC-CMJP recipe is modality agnostic.
Which is thrilling to think about.
Yeah, they focus their tests on text and images, but the underlying mathematics don't actually care what the modalities are. If this tightly coupled, self-correcting loop works so flawlessly for text and images, imagine what happens when you extend this math to continuous audio and video generation.
It can change everything.
Picture a future model simultaneously composing a symphony. The text branch is generating the sheet music, the time signatures, and the precise instrumentation, while the audio branch is dynamically rendering the actual sound wave.
All at the same time.
Right. Under the CO2 Jump framework, if the audio branch starts rendering a cello that drifts out of tempo, the model could instantly kill and re-render those audio tokens the exact millisecond they contradict the written sheet music.
And all within a single forward pass.
Exactly. The potential for perfectly synchronized, infinitely self-correcting video and audio generation is massive, and it really seems like we finally have the mathematical foundation to pull it off. Thank you for tuning in to AI Paperslop. Keep experimenting, keep pushing the boundaries of your inference pipelines, and we'll see you on the next deep dive into the research.